last part I would like to go over the setup, how we came to this result. I added some basic textures and adjusted the groom and the body setup. So let's start with the groom. Oh, it's calculating for a second. Here we go. So when we go into the groom, this is what we already had. Like we had our set length here. Let me move this down here somewhere. We had our groom setup, then our set length before. Then we merge it. So if I go to the scene view, so we see something, this is basically what we had before. We mirror it to the other side, and now I added a hair generator to have a more dense groom. And what I did afterwards is I randomized the length a little bit. So if I turn this on and off, you can already see. I have another length randomization where I also got an attribute painted. Actually, there is nothing painted, but you can control it through the mask length randomize. So once that is done, there is another guide groom for adjusting the groom. So if I turn that on and off, you see I just adjusted it, changed how the groom is painted in the back here. Actually, we can adjust that a little bit. So yeah, it's just some combing on top. Once that is done, I resampled the groom a little bit. So when we go in here, I just resampled it so they all got the same amount of segments again, 8 segments. And then we did some bands. So this band is basically, let me show you here. Yeah, it just pushes the groom outside a little bit, and it's controlled by a mask here. So you can see where we bend our hairs. Once that is done, we also got a lift here, which adjusts just the feet here. So we lift the groom here a little bit on the feet. And in the end, what we do is we add a clump. So we clump together our groom a little bit to get more structure in the hair later on. So that's what the groom looks like. And now in the hair tree, when you go in here and see what changed, give it a second to calculate. Let's start from here. So what I did here is I added an attribute called segment length and painted that one, and then I transferred that attribute from the skin, because it was painted on the skin, to the primitives. The resample node allows you to use a painted attribute called segment length, and as soon as you paint that, the resampler will recognize it and will automatically use it for its segment length. So this is also a way to adjust the amount of segments in different areas by just painting a map. And once this is done with cooking, I will show you how it works. All right, here we go. So let's check out this map here. We got values here on the lower part of the body. We have smaller values. That should be like 0.1. That means the segment length is 0.1 and we have more segments on hair. Here on the other side you can see the segment length is bigger, so we end up with less points. So you can already see here that on the belly here and the neck we have way more segments than on areas like here on the legs or on the back of the on the body parts, on the other body parts. And you don't need to do anything special here. It will just take that attribute as soon as you paint it and then transfer it to your points and promote it to your primitives. Because that resample node, it needs that segment length on the primitives. All right, let me turn this off and let's continue here. So another change that I made is I turned off the hair clump for the actual clumping, and that's what we use for the big clumps instead of the clumps we had before. Because that did some clumping which I didn't want it in the end, so I just turned it off. All right, another thing I changed is with the guide partition which we use for parting. I actually thought, okay, in the whole tree, the only thing I use is that part distance in our expressions to adjust values. And then in the very end of the graph, I actually use the guide partition to do parting. So I thought, okay, let's transfer that parting distance attribute from the guides coming out of the guide partition, from the hair, to what we have before that guide partition. And the reason for that is so I can use the guides without what happens here. And what happens here is, let me reduce the amount of hair so we can see that better. And then we can go to wire mode a little bit more. So if you turn off that thicken, and now let's go in here, we should actually see our curves. Yeah, it's like, here's one. So we see our guide curves for the parting here, or the parting curves, and they get used in the whole tree. Like whenever we apply some sort of operation, that operation is also applied to our parting curves. In the end, I didn't want that because it caused some sort of instability. So I thought, okay, let's, like you can see the difference here. Like in that graph, I don't have those parting curves anymore, but I transfer the parting distance. And then I use that in the graph, in the continuous, in the rest of the graph. So this way we get rid of the parting curves, and we can just continue our graph here. The next changes which were done are actually further down. So if we go down here, yeah, there is like that second guide partition node now, which was added and which uses that input from the curves we have here. So the curves get fed into the new guide partition in the second one, and that then drives the parting. All right. So one thing I did add is like a length randomization here. It just randomizes the length in overall. And then I also added this hair mask white hairs, which is just in the shelf. So you can just hit add white hairs, and what you get is when we go to materials, the materials have an option, use white hairs, and you can just set a color. So that's quite useful, and you get some white hairs, which just break up the shading a little bit. Okay, let me quickly check what else was changed. So the rest basically was just value changes in the nodes we already had. So let's also go over our viscous setup. So I wanted to generate a setup for the whiskers where we can just take a groom and render that groom. So I generated a new groom. That's just a guide groom. I use it to blend new strands, and then I directly deformed those strands. Since this is quite, this is not really complex, I kept everything in one guide groom node, like the planting and the grooming and so on. And what happens next is we have a second skin deform node here. Let me move this down here. So we can feed that into a new hair generation node. And in the hair generation node, what we basically do is we do the same thing we did in our main hair. Like we create a UV attribute and then we extract the U value only, and we can use that for a ramp then. Let me see. Okay, I need to turn this here off. All right, so we're using a ramp here, and this ramp is then used to set the width of our groom. This is needed for rendering. Let me change that ramp quickly so we can better see what's happening here. So as you might see, this ramp now changes the width of the hair. So if we make it thinner, you see also the thickness changes, and if I put that to like a value of 3, which doesn't work, so let me change here instead of 0, 1, make it 1. Oh yeah, my fault. So if we now change it back to something, you can see that the width of the hair changes because we set it here with the color value. So we use a color, just the red channel of our color, and set our width with that. So by doing so, we can adjust it here with our ramp. Let's see, we want something like this here. And then we just use another color node to override the color, so we have like a constant white color again. As soon as we did set our width, it doesn't matter what we do with the color afterwards. And that's all we need. After that, we output our groom and we can render it like this. All right, one last thing to look at is our hair shader. So I did a basic setup with a root texture and a tip texture, and then I got a root and tip blend which mixes those two based on our map. So I can say, okay, when I paint white here and black here, then here I got a root and tip texture, and here I mix it so only my tip texture is used, and I got less of the root color in there. And that is just plugged into my root diffuse color, root specular color, and tip specular, and tip diffuse color. And then I also use like the tip color with a color correction, so I make it a little bit brighter and use that in our white hair color. That's basically all we use for this setup. So we have some basic texturing going on. Yeah, and that's about it for this tutorial. We might go into better shading and texturing in an additional tutorial. And I also want to show some additional little tricks and techniques which might be available for an add-on for this one, which will get posted for, and I don't know when, but I keep you posted. I hope you had fun and I hope you learned a lot in this series, and thanks for watching.